Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be able to rise to speak on this matter in Committee of the Whole, and to speak as well about the relevance, the impact, the import of the amendments to Bill 1 that are being put forward by this government. Let me start from the overarching position to just review relatively quickly why it is this Act as a whole is a bad idea and why, as a whole, it is quite unfixable. In essence, this Act, Mr. Chair, generates unprecedented amounts of uncertainty in the province relative to, in essence, the rule of law. And it does so in a way that undermines investor certainty, not only here in Alberta, but outside of Alberta, in the rest of Canada, and indeed outside of Canada amongst investors internationally. And it does so through a number of different means, Mr. Chair. First of all, quite honestly, the whole rollout of this Premier's flagship bill is a lesson in legislative incompetence. We had a Premier introduce the bill on Throne Speech Day, and within an hour or so, we'd all had a chance to look at it, and we understood that this Premier was attempting to take for herself unprecedented anti-democratic powers in a broad-ranging way outside of an emergency, in a way that we'd never seen in a proposed piece of legislation in the province of Alberta before. And then we had the Premier and various and sundry agents of the Premier insist that what the bill said was not what the bill said. And they claimed we hadn't read the bill, Mr. Chair, and they claimed we didn't understand the bill, Mr. Chair, and they claimed that it didn't say what it said. And so that was very surprising, Mr. Chair, because it became increasingly clear to those Albertans who really pay attention to these things that the Premier herself had either not read her own bill, or alternatively was incredibly poorly briefed on her bill, which makes us question the capacity of the folks who are around her, or actually did know what was in the bill and was just deciding to say something else. And that in and of itself is deeply troubling. So that whole drama, for lack of a better term, around the impact of the King Henry VIII clause, what it meant, the fact that it was there, leading up until last night when the government finally introduced an amendment, which we are discussing today, that in part included the elimination of that clause, does not generate confidence in no way, shape, or form. And I've heard that from so many folks across the province over the course of the last 7 days. They truly worry about who is at the helm and what they know about the job they've been asked to do by the 1% of the population that selected the Premier to lead the government caucus last month. And so that display in and of itself drives a tremendously deep level of uncertainty across this province. Now, there are also, of course, things in the legislation that create a tremendous amount of a lack of clarity. This whole issue of who it is the government can direct, the language around anyone with a fiscal relationship with the government. It's actually not clear to us how far and deep into the private sector the government would purport to go with this bill. So once again, of course, that creates a lack of clarity. The consequences of this government declaring that federal laws are not applicable or not enforceable here in Alberta, that, of course, creates a tremendous lack of just clarity in terms of what the bill's intended to do. Then, of course, uncertainty also is driven by the likely unconstitutionality of elements of this legislation, and the member from Edmonton Centre, as well as the member from Edmonton Northwest, were just outlining those points again today even. And I will say, and I'll talk in just a moment, there is nothing in these amendments that appear to undo the primary concerns around the constitutionality of this piece of legislation. And then finally, it is very clear to us that we have a very, very serious problem embedded within this legislation as it relates to treaty rights in this province. And that also creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Now, Mr. Chair, this is not me sitting around coming up with fun, exciting ways to suggest that this bill creates uncertainty. This is me listening to Albertans. We have heard from the head of CAP that any bill that creates uncertainty for investors is a bill that is a bad idea for the province. We have heard from the Calgary Chamber of Commerce that this bill creates uncertainty for many members, a range of members within the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. And I understand the Premier likes to talk about those anonymous folks who allegedly called her one day and said that they don't agree with the head of the chamber. But I will say that, we dispatched 3 of our MLAs to go to a chamber function a couple of days ago, and they spoke to a multiplicity of chamber members at that function, and actually they all kind of agreed with the head of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce and said, yeah, no, this is very, very concerning, and it creates a lot of economic and investor uncertainty. They spoke actually to investors, in fact. We also heard from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, who also said that this bill creates tremendous economic uncertainty. And then today we were pleased to stand with a former Governor of the Bank of Canada, David Dodge, who outlined in great detail the means through which this legislation created uncertainty, essentially saying that the incompatibility of this legislation with provincial and federal laws and the inability of international investors to predict which laws would apply to the investment that they might or might not make would inevitably lead to those folks choosing other jurisdictions, and that was a huge problem because we are in a place right now where everybody is competing for international investment dollars, and we are only one jurisdiction, and we are doing the exact opposite of delivering a message that this is the place where those dollars should come. So that came from the former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge, someone who, just to review, served under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So the final problem with this bill as a whole, of course, and it has again been touched on by other members of my caucus, is that it is, to a large degree, diverting this government's attention from the issues that actually do matter to Albertans. And there have been now multiple polls that have been both publicly and quietly published on this issue, and I know members opposite get access to some of those private, non-published polls that we do that reinforce the fact that this is absolutely not what the people of this province want to hear their government talking about right now. And yet that's what they are doing. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in the midst of the probably single most damaging flu, COVID, RSV epidemic impacting children in decades in this province, we have a premier who on one hand is unwilling to stand and recommend that children get the flu vaccine, and on the other hand was unable to answer the question I asked her yesterday about the resignation of the 2 deputy chief medical officers of health. Why? Probably because she was spending so much time trying to finally understand what the bill she had introduced meant after she finally decided to read it. But the point is that what she wasn't doing was finding out or being briefed on the fact that we actually have the top 3 public health positions in this province right now are vacant. I mean, yeah, we have someone who's theoretically called the Chief Medical Officer of Health, but he's got a full-time job already. And so really, he's doing this literally off the side of his desk without an extra cent. So he's a volunteer, and then now the other two positions, we have resignations with both of them. And we have a premier who apparently didn't know that that was happening at a time when our emergency rooms are overwhelmed with far too many children desperate for medical care. So that's what happens when the government is diverted from the issues they should be dealing with. So now we have a government that has introduced amendments. And let me be perfectly clear about the consequences of these amendments. I will say on the first matter, no question, the amendments now effectively eliminate the Henry VIII clause. It now clarifies that we are no longer dealing with statutes, pieces of legislation, but rather we are dealing with regulations, and that is fine. That is good step forward. I don't know why we needed to be subjected to so much arrogant insults from the Premier. I wish on the first day when we had pointed out what she had done that she would have risen, apologized, thanked us for pointing out the mistake, and just indicated right then that she would fix it. But no, apparently we've not quite learned the lessons she claims to have learned from former Premier Ralph Klein. Nonetheless, so that's the first thing that this amendment does, and that is good. It does not, however, for all the reasons I've just outlined, address the much bigger problems embedded in this bill. The second thing that this amendment does is it attempts to limit the lack of clarity in one element of the bill by more directly defining what amounts to harmful. And I thought what they had done, actually, when I first heard about these amendments, Mr. Chair, what I actually thought they'd done was actually eliminated reference to harmful altogether, and otherwise just said, you know, this will just be a matter that is brought before the House when, in the opinion of the House, we think that there's been an unconstitutional act on the part of the federal government. But no, it turns out, no, that's actually not what they did. They didn't actually even do that either. They kept the possibility of passing a resolution if it is harmful, and then they went on to say, and harmful means that the range of actions that are covered by this piece of legislation that the federal government may take affect something that's in provincial jurisdiction. That's all that has to happen. Then it's harmful. It affects it. That's what the legislation says. Just want you to be clear. It doesn't have to hurt something that's in provincial jurisdiction. It doesn't have to diminish something that's in provincial jurisdiction. It just needs to affect it. And if it affects something that's in provincial jurisdiction, then it is officially harmful. Let's walk down the list of things that would fall under that definition, Mr. Chair. Well, we had a very good news announcement on the part of the government a little over a month ago in the industrial heartland, where a new project, $1.3 billion, was announced by Air Products. And that particular project, excellent project, is a project focused on developing hydrogen, reducing emissions while still taking advantage of our energy resources here. Very good project. And in that project, I think it was about $1.4 billion. $140 million was committed by the provincial government through what is now the successor to our original PDP program. And $300 million was committed by the federal government. Well, pretty sure that amounts to an initiative on the part of the federal government that affects a matter that is within provincial jurisdiction. Yep, sure does. It does, Mr. Chair. But that is how they have changed the definition to include harmful, or to be harmful. So in fact, they've not limited the scope of this word harmful at all. And in fact, it still, could even relate to things that the Premier has articulated her extreme displeasure with, like, for instance, the billions of dollars that the provincial government is receiving in order to support young families across this province through finally bringing in a robust child care program. So this second amendment then, Mr. Chair, does nothing to effectively limit the definition of harmful, and it does not eliminate the provision which actually is at the heart of what is one of the two most unconstitutional elements of this bill, which is the belief that the legislature can step into the shoes of the courts and make a determination about the constitutionality of a federal action or a federal initiative or a federal act. And as a result of that still being in there, they have not actually touched in one bit, well, not by one iota, the most offending part of this legislation as it relates to that particular head of unconstitutionality. So there is no change here. They still allow themselves the ability to make a motion that says, in the brilliant opinion of this UCP majority government, the folks who literally spent 7 days telling us that what was written in their bill was not written in their bill, that with their brilliant guidance, we're going to determine what is now unconstitutional on the part of the federal government, and then we're going to do a range of things that we don't really describe to a range of people who we can't really identify. So it's this kind of thing, Mr. Chair, that drives investors to say, yeah, you know, I could open my tech company or my digital media company in Calgary, or I could just go to BC where they're a little less close to the edge of diving into off the deep end, and where I've got a better sense of what the laws are. That, I'm afraid, is what one of the consequences of this horrible piece of legislation is going to be. Now, the other thing that is critically important about this bill, and the reason why it must be rejected out of hand, which is completely unaffected by the amendments brought forward today or last night in the dark of night by this government, is the fact that we do not address the fundamentally flawed approach taken by this government when it comes to addressing the rights of Indigenous people in this province. We have a legal obligation to acknowledge treaty rights. That's not done here. We have a moral obligation to pursue genuine reconciliation by refusing to speak to a single one of the Grand Chiefs of the treaties here in Alberta. The Premier has failed to demonstrate any modicum of reconciliation. By repeatedly claiming that she has one person that she's spoken to, and then at the same time failing to apologize for the fact that her minister claimed to have spoken to the actual representatives of the treaties, failing to apologize for the fact that he claimed to do that when he had not. That is the opposite of reconciliation. And finally, this government also has a practical obligation to acknowledge the treaty rights of Indigenous people, because that is the only way you can actually build a genuine partnership in economic growth and development. Acknowledging treaty rights and pursuing reconciliation does not mean that you say to Indigenous Albertans, we'll give you this one-time opportunity to partner with us on this one economic deal that we picked. That is not reconciliation. That is not treaty rights. They have an opportunity to partner, yes, but they have a right to choose not to, and instead to ask that they be treated as the treaty leaders that they are, and this government failed to do that. So they have now picked a fight with Indigenous leaders and treaty chiefs across this country, and they have injected a higher level of instability, legal instability, into our whole regulatory regime than had existed for years. So they have really messed this up, Mr. Chair. And the fact of the matter is that it's not at all touched on by the amendments, and to pursue the objective of passing this legislation today, tonight, tomorrow, without pulling back and engaging in meaningful consultation is to ensure that this will be challenged in moments and that it will be found to be unconstitutional, and is to absolutely torch the critically important nation-to-nation relationship that should exist between this Premier and between the leaders of the treaties. All right.
Other members looking to add to debate tonight. I see the honourable member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I rise to speak to the amendment on Bill 1, the Hot Max Express, that is Bill 1. Mr. Chair, I'm going to speak first about the separation of powers a little bit and usurping of the role of the courts, which is what this legislation does and the amendment says not touch. And then I would like to make a few comments about the democratic implications of such a project and the bad faith conduct, essentially, that is characterized by both the introduction of this bill, the amendment process, and ultimately the time allocation and so on of this bill. Why is this happening right now? Why does this legislation take the form that it does? I would argue that this is happening by design of a usurping of the role of the courts and a politicization of the courts by certain elements of the far right who have now adhered themselves to the UCP electoral coalition and have made themselves much more prominent by the election of this particular leader. This bill, when one looks at the Free Alberta strategy, one can just read what they have said, which is the federally appointed judges are accused in that strategy of, quote, blatant judicial activism and bias against the constitutionally enshrined jurisdictional rights of Alberta, which is, I guess, an odd thing to say about a Supreme Court that remains majority appointed by Stephen Harper. But here we are. The fact of the matter is that this bill has its provenance out of a wing of the Conservative movement that has become more prominent, that has in fact taken over the Conservative movement in this country, and that has no regard for the rule of law, for the separation of powers, and for our institutions of liberal democracy. In fact, it is sui generis to this movement that they undermine those aspects of what makes for a good life for all of us at every available turn. And so here in this bill, and the Leader of the Official Opposition just spoke to many of its implications in terms of investment and so on. I want to do something that probably she wishes that she could do, because I know her well enough by now, which is I'm going to get into a little bit of detail about separation of powers. Let's buckle up here. One of the core functions of